another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of public interest to the Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. Uh, as you've been reading in the news, we are very concerned now about the behavior of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And we need to look carefully at every aspect of that relationship and to try to understand for ourselves why Venezuela is behaving this way and why it has behaved this way for such a long period of time. And we can ask ourselves the question, will it ever change? And in this program, I want to look at the men from Miraflores, because Miraflores, apparently it was patterned on the White House. So it is a very important complex. The president lives there, but it's also its office. The cabinet meets there. And Miraflores, the Palace of Miraflores, that's what it's called. It's not just a little state house, it's a palace. And it is the seat of government, really. The cabinet meets there. The council of ministers, it's called, meet there. And it is, I would say, that's where our foreign policy comes from. It's the brain trust. That is where foreign policy towards Guyana is formulated. So the decrees and the directives from Miraflores, which is the president's office and residence, define Venezuelan policy towards Guyana. It has been so for nearly 100 years. But it hasn't always been occupied, but certainly over the last 6 decades, the legitimate president of Venezuela has lived and worked in Miraflores. We need to go back in history. This is not a history lesson, but we need to understand, what's happening at Miraflores. Although we are familiar with the names of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, the present phase of the territorial controversy actually started with President Romulo Betancourt, who is in office between 1959 to 1964. Some Venezuelans regard him as the father of Venezuelan democracy, because prior to that, you had a lot of army generals seizing power, and the way the country was managed, although it is very prosperous, and it's been prosperous for a long time. Romulo Betancourt got into office in 1959, and I think he put democratic processes on a sound footing. But he took office at a time when there was some turmoil in the Caribbean, particularly revolutionary Cuba, as you know, had created a socialist republic on the island. And there is evidence that Cuba had backed various guerrilla movements in South America, and particularly one, the MIR, which means the Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionario, which is the revolutionary movement of the left, had threatened to overthrow President Betancourt. Now, Venezuela is home, or was home, back in those days in the 1960s, to the largest United States corporate investments, especially in petroleum and minerals. So in all of South America, Venezuela was home to the largest US investment in petroleum and minerals. And US President John Kennedy actually visited Venezuela and launched the Alliance for Progress in 1961. Of course, to protect American interests, but also to deepen democracy, develop industry, and defeat the growing influence of Cuba. Now, at that time, as you know, in 1957, the PPP had gotten into office, And elections were held again in 1961. And it's no secret that Dr. Cheddi Jagan and the PPP were closely aligned to the revolutionary government of Cuba. And in fact, many members of the PYO, the Progressive Youth Organization, the youth arm of the PPP, had traveled to Cuba to receive training, not in electrical wiring and vehicle repair, but in sabotage and bomb making. They were preparing for some serious violence in Guyana, and some people thought that they were part of this Cuban-inspired revolutionary movement that was going to turn the entire continent into another Vietnam. So President Betancourt in Venezuela got very jittery, and he decided that he did not want Cuban revolutionaries on his eastern border because he felt that Guyana, under Cheddi Jagan and the PPP, were too close to Cuba at that time. And this might have been one of the motivations that he did what he did, because in 1962, his foreign minister, Marcos Briceño, appeared before the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization, because Guyana was still a British colony. And of course, most Guyanese wanted to get independence, but President Betancourt of Venezuela had his foreign minister, Minister of External Affairs, go before the United Nations Special Committee to denounce the award of 1899. So that is a very big moment in the territorial controversy, because before that, there was no strong evidence that Venezuela wanted the findings of the 1899 tribunal to be overturned. But from 1962, when the Venezuelan foreign minister appeared before the Special Committee on Decolonization, we knew that this was not going to end well for Guyana. And the PPP was in office at that time, and the ball started rolling. Now, let us move forward a little bit. Venezuela wants to conduct the settlement of the territorial question on a bilateral basis. They don't want to go to the courts. They want to settle out of court. Why? Because they know that they don't have a strong legal case. And I call it the Borelli doctrine. Borelli was one of the foreign ministers. But his idea was that any solution to the territorial controversy should be bilateral. Now, this is a trap. He does not want to go to the court. He wants a strong Venezuela with 123,000 soldiers, tanks, battleships, aircraft, fight aircraft, to negotiate with Guyana, which is still a very small, poor, weak country. Venezuela is 4 times the size of Guyana. Everything is bigger. And it's an asymmetrical relationship. But Guyana wants a solution based on law. We don't want a solution based on domination, based on bribery. We want a solution based on law. So Venezuela has always embraced this doctrine, I would call it, of globality. Said, don't let's stop with the border alone. Let's stop with the development of the whole 5 regions that they claim. Guyana has 10 regions, Venezuela is claiming 5. And they don't want to speak about legitimate authority, ownership of the 5 regions. They say, let us jointly develop this region, which they call the Zona en Reclamación. But of course, they must approve everything. I think some international relations theorists call it Finlandization. Russia used to try to use that technique on Finland. Everything Finland did, had to be approved by Moscow. And I think the Venezuelans were trying to impose this Finlandization on Guyana, that they must control the development of the entire 5 regions. So Venezuela started to offer inducements and concessions. They want to build roads. They want to offer electrification from the Guri Dam. And of course, they wanted to give debt relief because Guyana was indebted to Venezuela for petroleum and other purposes. They'll buy Guyanese rice. They built a gymnasium on Mandela Avenue. They built a rehabilitation center in West Berbice, the Hugo Chavez Center. And they included Guyana for the Petro-Caribe sales, not at concessionary rates, but at concessionary terms. So we don't have to pay cash on the nail. But on the other hand, they employed threats. If we don't do as you're told, we got overflights from fighter jets over Ettringbang. Some of our vessels were seized at sea. There were hostile incursions. And this is what is still happening now in December 2023. So it was worse than carrot and stick. It was stick and stick. And Venezuela tried to subordinate Guyana, make Guyana a vassal state over this territorial question. A particularly important instrument in Venezuelan diplomacy was petroleum. As you know, Venezuela has some of the world's largest reserves. Possibly in this hemisphere, it's probably the largest reserves in the hemisphere. And Venezuela simply petrolized diplomacy. Petroleum was the basis of its relationships. And particularly under Hugo Chavez Frias, he established something called the Bolivarian Alliance for America, which is an acronym for ALBA, ALBA in Spanish. But the English version is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, which tried to remove American influence, particularly in South America and the Caribbean. And this petroleum policy was the centerpiece of Chavez's foreign policy. And as part of this ALBA, we find that several English-speaking Caribbean countries were recruited. And Antigua and Barbuda, Bolivia, well, that's South America, Cuba, Dominica, English-speaking Dominica, Ecuador, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Nicaragua. So when this was established first in 2004, these were some of the early members. So you start to understand that many CARICOM members are actually members of this important Venezuelan grouping called ALBA. So it's not that ALBA and CARICOM are daggers drawn, but I don't even want to suggest the divided loyalty, but the facts are some Anglophone Caribbean countries are firmly wedded to economic relationships with Venezuela through ALBA. We must understand, my friends, that petroleum, even now, accounts for about 80% of Venezuelan export revenues. And about half of what the government earns comes from petroleum. So Hugo Chavez had this grand vision of creating a pan-continental goal of uniting all of South America and the Caribbean, possibly to stand up against America. But the point is that ALBA was able to include several Caribbean states. Now, in addition to using petroleum, which of course all these states need, and although it wasn't cheap, they got it on concessionary terms. Venezuela also used the stick, the big stick on Guyana. The very year Guyana became independent, 1966, the very year Venezuela signed the so-called Geneva Agreement, Venezuela pounced on Coco Island, a little 7.5 square kilometer island in the Cuyuni River. As soon as the British Army left, the British Army has been here since 1953. They stayed until 1966 because of the disturbances by the PPP, particularly. But as soon as the British Army left, Venezuela pounced. For some reason, they never tried to invade when the British were here, but that's another story. But they pounced on Coco Island, and they've never given it up since 1966. And Venezuela still claims 5 of Guyana's 10 regions. You know, region 1, 2, 7, 8, and 9, almost in entirety, are still claimed by Venezuela. That is the Zona en Reclamación. Since 1968, maybe before some of you were born, President Raul Leone issued a decree 1552 in 1968, annexing the sea off of the Pomerun, Supinam, and Borima Waini regions. You know, the whole front was designated as part of Venezuelan territory. This, my friend, is the start of really aggressive behavior by Venezuela towards Guyana. And in 1969, January, Venezuela actually supported an armed rebellion in Rupununi. There was a group of rebels who wanted to secede. They were accustomed to this hacienda lifestyle. And when the PNC-UF coalition tried to fulfill its independence promise to the Amerindians to set up an Amerindian Land Commission and give Amerindians the lands that they were entitled to. The ranches, some of them had been, a small ranch would be like 25 square miles. You know, it's huge. It's a small group of ranches. All of them were related. They were cousins. All of them had the same grandfather and grandmother. But they resisted the PNC-UF coalition, and they tried to secede, but the weapons came from Venezuela, the training came from Venezuela, the flights came from Venezuela. And many of them, after the rebellion was quelled, went to Venezuela. And as the saying goes, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And this is what happened in 1969. So Venezuela was deeply involved in destabilizing Guyana, not just on the border, but when you consider that Rupununi is the size of Costa Rica, you can see it would have really torn a huge part of Guyana away from our mother country. And there were many other incidents, you know, when a group of Americans wanted to set up a satellite tracking station in the Borima Waini. It was opposed. When Guyana tried to issue petroleum licenses in the Maritime zone, it was opposed. In 2000, this is nothing new. This is before there was a substantial discovery of petroleum in Guyana's waters. This is just exploratory, and Venezuela was opposing exploration. Of course, by the time AP and UFC got into office in May 2015, well, by that time, belatedly, Guyana discovered that it was sitting on huge reserves. and it was never exploited before. There was, there was inadequate preparation from the previous administration, and well, as you say, the rest is history. But in May 2015, Venezuela issued decrees 1787 purporting to annex the maritime zone where petroleum was to be extracted from. So you can see the men in Miraflores, this palace, Venezuelan presidential palace, were tracking the relation with Guyana since 1962, when the matter went before the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization. So it is nothing new. This is not a matter that arose suddenly in 2023. I'm talking about 1962. And every Venezuelan president has pursued the same line. There's no change from president to president. They've consistently pursued a line of intimidation. Starting from Romulo Betancourt, he was president of Venezuela between 1959 and 64. He approached the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization to denounce the arbitral award of 1899. And from there on, all hell broke loose. President Raul Leone, he issued a decree in decree number 1152 in 1968, annexing all of the waters off of the Barima, Waini, and Pomeroon Supernam coasts. Rafael Caldera blocked petroleum exploration rights, again in the maritime zone. President Herrera Campins, he blocked the Upper Missouri Hydro Project in 1981. President Carlos Andres Perez, he thought he was clever. He actually came to try to persuade the president of Guyana to give them a piece of the coast in return for, Venezuelan assistance to build the Upper Missouri Hydro Project. And all he wanted was, they call access to the Atlantic. In Spanish, it's called Salida al Atlántico. Salida al Atlántico. And they wanted to become an oceanic power. Venezuela doesn't have access to the ocean. Venezuela is a Caribbean country. It has a very long Caribbean coast. But to get to the Atlantic, it has to go through other states' waters. And Venezuela didn't want that. They wanted to have their own Atlantic coast. That is why it is called Salida al Atlántico. So you might have been reading stories about Venezuela trying to get the Salida al Atlántico, access to the Atlantic. And in return for that Salida, they offered to reduce the size of the territorial claim and to finance the Upper Missouri Hydro Project. Well, that was not to happen on the Forbes Barnum and the PNC. And then you had Jaime Lucinchi. Again, he continued the tradition of resisting Guyanese development. And there was some disturbance in Venezuela. As you know, there was an attempted golpe, or coup d'etat. But eventually, Hugo Rafael Chavez became president. But he issued a specific, he visited Guyana, all smiles and hugging babies, but he's a very serious man. I think he admitted being part of preparation of plans to invade Guyana when he was an army officer. And then, of course, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, he visited also, and he was there smiling with President Ramotar, but he issued decrees number 1787 and 1859 and 2015 when I was in office. Again, he tried to claim part of the maritime zone where he felt petroleum exploration was going. In fact, he almost completely obliterated Guyana's access to the maritime zone. When you see the lines that they drew on Guyana's EEZ. I mean, if it wasn't so serious, you'd laugh because it is completely lawless, completely ridiculous. And that's why this matter had to go to the court, because after 60 years, Venezuela wasn't relenting, and it was using its military power, using economic power, using its petroleum diplomacy to undermine Guyana. So we were in a very bad position by 2015, and things were getting worse. So the aggression and provocation by Venezuela intensified. They seized the petroleum exploration vessel, the Technic Pardana. Within weeks of Maduro visiting President Ramatari in Georgetown, by the time he got home in October, same 2013, they seized the Technic Pardana, an unarmed petroleum exploration vessel. And back in 2018, when APNU was in office, they seized the Ramform Tethys, which is another petroleum vessel. At will, Venezuelan Navy seizes fishing vessels in the maritime zone. Fighter jets overfly Guyana territory at Etringban. So life near to this country, Venezuela, has become intolerable for many of the border villages in Western Guyana, what they call the borderlands. So these decrees are all directed to obstructing or preventing offshore exploration of petroleum in Guyana's waters. And that is why we must be careful about it. Conciliation, Venezuela is not in the mood for legal settlement. Venezuela wants bilateral talks, and it hopes that by talking bilaterally, it will continue to offer inducements, and sooner or later, dripping water wears away the stone. Sooner or later, it's going to soften the brain of some president who says, yes, let's give them a piece of the land. But it's not going to happen under the APNU, AFC. It's not going to happen under the PNC. And that's one of the reasons why they funded the so-called Hugo Chavez Center in West Berbice. That's one of the reasons why they funded the gymnasium on Mandela Avenue. And they had there are a lot of agreements with Venezuela, agreements to sell rice and provide urea for agriculture, and giving Guyana access to Petro-Caribbean. They offered to build a pipeline, they offered to develop roads. But Venezuela has a mindset on the maritime zone where the petroleum is. And the moment Guyana relents, we lose that forever. That oil, that EZ belongs to our grandchildren. What we need in Tacuba Lodge, this is the opposite of Miraflores Palace. Venezuela has the Miraflores, we have Tacuba Lodge. We need a clearer strategy for our diplomacy. It's difficult to understand, quite frankly, what is going on at Tacuba Lodge. We need strong, energetic ambassadors in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Caracas, in Brasilia. After 3 years, it is difficult to understand what the PPPC administration strategy is to appointing the finest diplomats in those capitals. These capitals are concerned with Guyana's national security. They are concerned with defense diplomacy. And I think after 3.5 years, we need to ask questions of our administration. We had to discontinue the United Nations Good Offices process because it had become sterile, infertile, barren. It played into Venezuela's hands. Venezuela could talk interminably because they're not suffering. We are not preventing the development of Eastern Venezuela, but Venezuela is preventing the development of Western Guyana. And they could go on talking forever. They've been talking for 60 years. So when we supported the United Nations Secretary General option to go to the courts, Venezuela opposed it. Venezuela said, why can't we go on talking? And we were tired of talking, and we want a legal settlement. Venezuelans are not supportive of a legal solution to the territorial question. They just wanted to continue its policy of globality, its policy of Finlandization, to reduce Guyana to a vassal state. But we need to have ambassadors in those capitals. We need to have ambassadors in the three neighboring capitals, Paramaribo, Caracas, Brasilia. We need to have high commissioners in the Caribbean. We need to have strong ambassadors in Washington, Ottawa, London, Brussels, to ensure that our security interests, our national security interests, are advanced. So the good officers process has ended. You know, we had a good record of service from Alistair McIntyre, from Oliver Jackman, and from Norman Beervan, but it could not bring about a settlement. And in the end, Secretary General Guterres appointed his own personal representative, Dagny Lander, but that didn't work either. And he probably thought he was dealing with some rebel group or something, and he was trying to broker. But the fact is that there was no rebellion. Any rebellion was coming from Venezuela. We knew what was settled in 1899. So it's not a matter of on the one hand and the other hand. We were in the right. And that is what we needed to establish by court, by the ICJ. And finally, thank God, you know, the Secretary General referred the matter to the ICJ where it is now. And we are looking forward to a favorable outcome. What is the way forward, my friends? This is very important to us, the present generation, and to future generations. What we need in this country to continue the traditional diplomacy and defense efforts, which were laid down from 1966 under the PNC administration, the PNC-UF administration. We need to strengthen our relations with international organizations, particularly CARICOM and the Commonwealth, OAS. We need to strengthen our defense operations, especially I had launched something called Operation Armadillo, which looked after all of the frontline villages, you know, from Imbatero right down to Whitewater, right down to Arau, Baramita. We need to deploy our troops there. We don't want to see our troops on Mandela Avenue with blue shirts cleaning up the, you know, the work that the municipal workers should be doing. We want to see our troops on the border, protecting the villages and giving the Venezuelans something to think about if they ever wanted to invade or to intrude into our territory. We want to see the parliamentary committees functioning, not in an ad hoc or episodic manner, but continuously reviewing every scrap of information about the territorial controversy. My friend, this is a serious matter, and we want serious attention paid on behalf of the whole Guyanese nation, and not only now, but also in the future. What happens now will affect Guyanese development for decades to come. We must be vigilant. We must ensure that those men in Miraflores Palace don't get their way. We must make sure that Guyanese interests are represented and defended at all costs. Thank you, and may God bless our country.